For a long time, the factions that represent equilibrium were ironically not in equilibrium. What I mean is that we only knew of one faction that follows this path, the Arbitrators. With the recent War Dance event, however, we are introduced to another faction that seemingly follows the equilibrium, the Clared Whe Temple. Interestingly, while both factions claim to follow the same path, they are almost completely opposite in nature to one another. How can two factions that seem different on the surface follow the same god? That's what we'll be discussing in this video, the factions that follow the aeon and path of equilibrium. Before we discuss that in more detail, if you want to see more Honkai Star Rail content, do consider subscribing to the channel. At the current point in the story, there isn't that much known about the path of equilibrium. We have only really met members of one of its faction, and the aeon itself has been rather elusive. Now, I've done a really deep dive into equilibrium and its aeon, so you can check that video out if you want more details, but for this video, I'll just give you a summarized version. While equilibrium evokes thoughts of balance or symmetry, what equilibrium might actually represent may be different from what you're expecting, almost as if there are two versions of it. When we examine the path in more detail, there are hints that suggest it's really more about control. The description provided in the databank on this path talks about surveillance systems, inescapable networks, and master plans, all orchestrated by its aeon, seemingly to ensure that the universe plays out in the way that it's designed to. The balance that equilibrium aims to achieve is more of an enabler to a predefined story. If the protagonist wins too much, equilibrium empowers the antagonist, but if the bad guys suddenly get lucky, then equilibrium will tip the balance in the direction of the good guys. It's kind of like plot armor if it was a sentient thing. As such, equilibrium's purpose seems more in line with keeping the story on track rather than traditional notions of balance. Anyone who tries to change their fate or destiny will ultimately end up failing, as hooh will ensure their luck runs out. Again, I've covered this in far more detail in the other video, so if you're interested in all that, consider checking it out. But why is this important to know, and what has this got to do with their followers? Well, as it turns out, one of the factions following equilibrium actually seems to act in accordance with the side of equilibrium that wants control, while the others seem to follow the traditional meaning of equilibrium, the meaning that seeks balance and fairness. So even among their followers, equilibrium seems split down the middle. Let's start off with the faction that might be more in line with its aeon's need for control, the Arbitrators. The Arbitrators are actually the very first faction we learn of that follows equilibrium, and we learnt of them all the way back at the release of the game. However, we haven't actually met any of them, and very little about them has been revealed. The Arbitrators are said to have originally been made up of individuals who admired the work of hooh, likely thinking that the aeon aspires for true balance. They try their best to uphold and attain equilibrium, but because the mortal mind cannot fathom the true scope of equilibrium, they often don't achieve the same levels of accomplishments their aeons do. This results in them often making mistakes, then having to fix the mistakes they make and end up achieving no real or tangible outcome, a zero-sum result. Over time, and likely after accepting their limitations, they continue to strive for equilibrium but at most aim for a zero-sum outcome, orchestrating things so that opposing concepts end up cancelling each other out. Good and evil, creation and destruction, life and death. If each of these concepts end up cancelling each other out, then the Arbitrators consider their job done. Despite their activities that seem like a huge waste of time, it's hinted in their description that the Arbitrators actually act according to the direct command of hooh themselves. But given their rather clumsy approach, I'm convinced that hooh is actually using them as agents in its machinations, rather than the Arbitrators being significant contributors, something the Arbitrators are likely unaware of. Earlier I mentioned that hooh may be focused on control rather than true balance, and it's stated that one way they achieve this is through the operation of an intricate surveillance network. I suspect that in hooh's intricate network of plans and agents, the Arbitrators are but one of their many tools used to influence the physical world. You can think of the Arbitrators as the representatives of hooh, given the aeon can't be the one appearing in the flesh. In addition, it is said that the Arbitrators are often mistaken for gods in other worlds, which makes me believe that Ho-Oh likely empowers these individuals far beyond a typical Pathstrider, perhaps to ensure that they are able to finish their tasks. Maybe all Arbitrators are given powers on par with an Emanator, and why they appear godlike to those that have witnessed them. So it would seem that the Arbitrators represent the side of Ho-Oh that seeks control and surveillance, but given we've never actually met them, it's hard to say for sure. The other faction that follows Ho-Oh seem to operate in a completely different fashion, and is more in line with the typical or expected ideal of equilibrium. The Clared Whe Temple is a faction that was introduced only during the recent War Dance Festival in 2.4, and are actually pretty interesting. You see, the Shanzhou Alliance has had a long-standing war against the denizens of abundance. But much like any war, not everyone wants to fight. Those that choose to abstain from fighting decided to band together and lead a more pacifist life. This is what makes up the membership of the Clared Whe Temple. Eventually, many others started flocking to the temple, with its followers comprising of not only denizens of abundance, but also Intellitrons displaced by Rubert's War and even Shanzhou natives. Now, what do a bunch of pacifists have to do with the path of equilibrium? Well, the monks of the temple believe that the universe's sufferings stem from the imbalance created between abundance and the hunt. When Yaoshe ascended, the lives that the aeon created and extended made the fragile balance of life and death go completely haywire. This is what brought the hunt into existence, which acted as a balancing force to the lives Yaoshe created. At least that's what the Clared Whe Temple believe. So this war essentially perpetuates an ongoing imbalance within the universe, and for things to return to a state of equilibrium, the fighting must essentially stop and the imbalance must be corrected. Because of this, many Borisins choose to abandon their faith in Yaoshe and establish the temple. They follow strict tenets and commandments that aim at severing an individual's ties with evil through inner strength and self-discipline. They not only avoid causing harm and damage, but also abstain from greed, hate, and overindulgence. What's even more interesting is that the followers of this belief don't actually view Ho-Oh as a god, but instead an enlightened forerunner, one that realized the universe needed to be balanced. In fact, the temple distances itself from the eons altogether, believing that because they are single-minded beings bound to the paths, the eons will ultimately lead the universe down the path of self-destruction. This makes them operate somewhat in the opposite manner to the Arbitrators, who, as I've mentioned, work to exact the eon's single-minded machinations onto the universe. However, as their faith is a result of the actions of two eons, the temple do acknowledge the significance of eons within reality and existence. So in truth, the followers of this faith and faction pursue true equilibrium, wanting the universe to be more balanced. This is why I mentioned earlier that both of Equilibrium's factions represent two sides of Equilibrium itself. The Arbitrators represent the side of Equilibrium and Ho-Oh that wants surveillance and control, while the Clared Whe Temple represent balance and harmony. It's really interesting that despite their clearly opposite beliefs, both factions actually still fit under the umbrella of Equilibrium. They're just different sides of it. This might be why Ho-Oh's own lore mentions that they were once separate and at some unknown time in the past merged into a singular being. Maybe at some point, they too were once separate concepts, one seeking control while the other seeked balance. Overall, the factions that follow Equilibrium and Ho-Oh are just as split down the middle as the Path and the Aeon are. While I don't think the Clared Whe Temple are necessarily evil or bad, the Arbitrators likely have questionable morals. I mean, if their only concern is to ensure a zero-sum result each time, it means that under their belief system, if a planet has an overabundance of life, somewhere else life must be extinguished to counteract it. This ideology will likely lead them to morally questionable actions that they might view as necessary, but is very clearly bordering on evil. I think that when we eventually cross paths with this Aeon and its path, the Arbitrators will likely be the antagonists, but who really knows? Star Rail's universe is filled with a lot of rather misleading things, and maybe the temple is the one that turns out to be corrupted. Personally, I happen to think Ho-Oh is a controlling overlord, ensuring the universe functions the way it's supposed to, and with the Trailblazer being someone who can go against fate itself, I don't see Ho-Oh or its followers liking that one bit. Our confrontation with them is likely to be very spicy. If we do end up learning more about these factions in the future, I'll be sure to release an update video, but for now, this will have to do. Do you think the Arbitrators are really the dark side of equilibrium, or are the Clared Whe Temple not all they seem? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you found the video entertaining, do consider liking and subscribing to the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and as usual, have a nice day.